So let me talk a little bit about the background. So I think it's pretty familiar to all of us that you know what we hear in you know in media, in general media, in academic papers, it's that Cuba's infant mortality rate is very comparable to those of rich nations, and you know much lower than those of developing nations, of course. And then I emphasize the fact that this is the reported infant mortality rate, not the actual infant mortality rate. We don't know the infant mortality rate. And then these claims are actually, when you look at this graph, for example, you can see that you know they're based on facts. Again, I'm talking about the reported rate. So in this graph, for example, you have you know Cuba's infant mortality rate at par with you know that of the U.S., that of Canada, and the European average. So one thing that I want you to have to remember as I go through the presentation is three key definitions that are crucial to understand the paper. One is, of course, one that a lot of us know, infant deaths, which are basically deaths that take place in the first year of life. Early neonatal deaths, that's the second term there, which are basically deaths that occur within the first week of life. And then late fetal deaths that are deaths that take place before birth, at about, you know, when the fetus is weighing at least 500 grams. And I have this graph here that you can take a look at it. And so basically the periods that I'm talking about that you should focus on would be these periods, early neonatal and late fetal. Now, one thing, so if there's something that I need you to remember from this presentation, or at least at this point of the presentation, is the following fact. And I quote a study here by Volkov and Miller in 1995 in population studies, that basically the late fetal deaths, you know, the one on the left there, and the early neonatal deaths are very close to each other. In other words, we should see that both indicators are very close to each other. And for example, I'll read the last sentence here not to read the whole quote. That is, we would not expect early neonatal mortality relative to the other republics to be low when the fetal mortality rate is very high. And then they're talking here about various Soviet republics. That's what their study is based on. Bottom line, late fetal and early neonatal deaths are closely related. If we see high late fetal deaths, we should also expect to see high early neonatal deaths, and vice versa. Now, I took a sample of, so the Peristat project is a very nice project in the sense that they collected data for about 25 European countries. And then one impediment in this literature is actually to find data where these indicators are comparable across countries. A lot of countries use their own definition of deaths and all of that. But now the Peristat study is very nice because they precisely try to target this. They collected data for these 25 countries using the same definition for all of them. And then what do we see? We see basically what we expected, right? Like, for example, we have countries that are typically low in terms of early neonatal deaths, are also low in late fetal deaths. And then on the other side, you have the same story. Countries like Latvia with high early neonatal deaths also have high late fetal deaths. Now, let's look at Cuba here. So Cuba I added at the end there. So we have a very low early neonatal deaths. In fact, if you look across that bottom line, that bottom graph there, it's pretty low. It's one of the lowest in the sample, right? So what do we expect? The same story for late fetal deaths. Well, we don't get that, right? We have a very high rate of late fetal deaths, which is, of course, a big discrepancy there. So another quote from Volkov and Miller, basically if early neonatal deaths are being systematically misclassified as late fetal deaths, then the ratio of late fetal to early neonatal mortality will be high compared to its expected value. So this is the picture that we get when we see the ratio. We have the dots at the bottom, those are the ones for the Peristat sample, and then the solid line, there's the average for those countries. And then if we consider that solid line to be, the expected value that Volkov and Miller are referring to, we see that Cuba over there, it's a huge outlier there. So an obvious question is why do we observe this disparity? Is it, maybe 2004 was a freak year, something happened and that's what we got. And then I'm talking about 2004 because this is the year that the Peristat sample was collected, so that's the year in question here. Is it a coding error in 2004? Well, not really. If you look at for the past 20 years or so, almost 20 years, the ratio, and that's the top graph, that's the ratio for Cuba. The ratio of late fetal deaths to early neonatal deaths it's pretty high. It's well above 4. So and again, this is speculation. This is nothing. This is not something that we can say for certain. Is it because there is misreporting on purpose? I think this is very plausible. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence from Cuban doctors that suggests that this is done on purpose. And I'll tell you why I think this is, there is a clear incentive to have this inflation in late fetal deaths, but not on the early neonatal deaths. And it's sort of an accounting trick. Basically, early neonatal deaths, the ones at the bottom there, they're a component of infant deaths. Late fetal deaths, however, they're not a component, by definition, of infant mortality. In other words, remember, by definition, the infant mortality, you have to be born alive and then die within a year to be counted into that indicator. Late fetal deaths, you don't have to be born alive, right? So in other words, it doesn't matter how much you inflate the late fetal deaths, that won't affect the infant mortality rate at all. However, the early neonatal deaths, they do affect it because they're a component of infant deaths. Now, what do I do to try to, so that was the first question, is there evidence that there is some misreporting? Well, I think it's pretty clear. The second question, what can we do about it? Can we get a number? Can we get can we get something? So I propose a 3-step method. Basically, one, so we saw in that graph with the dot for Cuba really high, we need to correct that ratio, right? Somehow we need to, get it closer to that expected value that it's supposed to take. So what I do is, and this slide is only for the people who are interested in the technical part, but you don't need this to understand the whole thing. Basically, the first step that I do, let's try to correct that ratio. That's what I do in the first equation there. And then I look, that's from a recommendation from Mario from last year. I try to look for more developmental measures. So I take in that X there, I look at, basically the idea here is to model the ratio as a function of a bunch of things. So what things do I look at? Well, I look at the maternal mortality rate, GDP, what else? The adolescent fertility rate, which is really a really important determinant of infant health, and the rate of anemia in pregnant women. So first step, estimate that ratio. So once you get that ratio, then you can get a correct measure for the late fetal death and the early neonatal deaths. So basically, you can obtain that from a very simple system of 2 equations. You have late fetal deaths. By definition, the ratio is just one over the other, right? So late fetal deaths over early neonatal deaths. So that first equation there, we can get the R Cuba there from the first part. So that equation there has 2 unknowns. We need another equation. So I get the second equation from a very plausible assumption. Basically, that the perinatal deaths, which are the sum of late fetal deaths and early neonatal deaths, are correctly specified for Cuba. In other words, there's no misreporting in perinatal deaths. And again, this is very plausible, because what I'm saying is the sum of the 2 is not wrong. It's just that the allocation between the 2 is the one that is wrong. In other words, instead of being like this, they're putting a lot of this into this. The sum is not affected. It's just the ratio what is affected, right? And then at the end, you get this nice, reduced form of how the estimate for the infant deaths, the ID there, should look like. And then now these are all this is all a function of things that we can get from the Cuban statistics. We get the ratio from the first step, perinatal deaths. We can get them by assumption that they're correctly specified from the Cuban statistics, and then the other ones as well. Now, what are the results? So for the year 2004, and I highlight the part that you really need to look at. For the year 2004, Cuba reported an infant mortality rate of about 5.79 deaths per 1,000 live births. So according to the estimates, on average, it should be about 10. That's a 10.14 there, with some lower and upper bound between 7.89 and 11.31. So conclusions to finish. So 3 main conclusions. One, looking at that 11.31 and the 5.79 reported by Cuba, you could guess that it's almost twice the true infant mortality rate could be almost twice the reported one. So once you take this new measure, the 11 point, 10.15 that I showed you before, and you compare that, this is a necessary exercise, right? The infant mortality rate is used a lot as a barometer for, how good a country is doing and all that. So when you take this new measure, this corrected measure, and you compare it to the infant mortality rate reported by other countries, we see that it's still low and pretty close to those of middle income countries. And I'm using the definition that the World Bank uses to define middle income, high income. It's still lower than those, but it's by no means comparable to those of high income countries, like previously believed. And then the third conclusion, looking at specifically at Latin America, because usually Cuba is used as an outlier, a positive outlier in the region. We see that, again, it's pretty low compared to other Latin American countries, but it's not necessarily a positive outlier. It's just a low infant mortality rate, but for example, Chile and Costa Rica might have infant mortality rates that are lower than that of Cuba. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. Now we have Rebecca Freeman from Johns Hopkins University School of International Studies. She's presenting her paper, which is called Gauging the Impact of Cuban Casino Dance in the U.S.
Okay, you got those two? Is that what you need?
So,
Do you want to do this PowerPoint and then shift over to that later?
I think actually I can start with this.
Okay, so you know how to work it on the lap?
Yeah,
On
we
the
just
Mac?
need to plug in the sound.
All right, try it that way. You want to hit whatever?
okay, thank you, Rebecca. Let's try to take 15, 20 minutes, okay?
Okay, so thank you everybody for coming and for being here. As Mario said, my name is Rebecca Freeman and I'm from San Francisco. The research that I'm going to be presenting today addresses the role of Cuban casino dancing in the United States. And just before I start, I wanted to get a quick show of hands. Who in the audience is familiar with casino? Okay, so about half. For those who are not, I'll give a very brief introduction. Casino is a social dance that was created in Cuba in the 1950s, and it can be danced in many forms. In the United States and outside of Cuba, it's often referred to as Cuban salsa, but it is, as I mentioned, a partner dance that is very dynamic in the sense that the steps are danced in a circular pattern. And so that evolved into being called rueda de casino, rueda meaning wheel in Spanish. And so when you have a rueda together, you essentially have many couples dancing together, and there are different calls. And it's a call and a response dance where somebody's leading the rueda, and he'll say, for example, dame. Dame means give me the next partner, and everybody will switch. So in this sense, it's very dynamic in the sense that partners are sharing with one another, and there's a common vocabulary of movements that everybody can experience together. So getting back to my personal history, which is what led me to this research, I have had the wonderful opportunity to live in many places in my life. I was born in San Francisco, but I studied on the East Coast. I worked in Paris and Geneva. I studied in Bologna. I've lived in Mexico. Now I live in Washington, D.C. And my common thread is that I've danced casino in all of these places. And what I noticed is that in my dance setting, I always interacted with people who are very diverse compared to my normal group of friends. Diverse in the sense that there are different ages, very diverse in terms of races, different socioeconomic classes, different professions. And these people who I danced with then became friends and helped me form community. So I started wondering, do others have this experience? Is casino, and my experience with casino, unique, or do other people also have this experience of diversity and broadening their social communities through dance? So this led me to research the topic on my own time, both in the United States and also through travel to Cuba. And I wanted to start with a short documentary that I've put together based on interviews that I conducted with heads of Rueda dance companies in Cuba, both in Santiago and in Havana. So 2 favors, if somebody is near the light switch, if they could turn off the lights. And also for the person who's filming in the back, I'm just wondering if during the video portion we could stop the filming because the artists have asked me not to put it on YouTube or not to have it broadcasted. So thank you. I can see. Can you see? Woo! All right. Maybe if someone could have some technical assistance.
Someone get the lights again over here. I might not be the best person to be helping her, so if someone feels like they know what they're doing with these things,
You can just try to plug it in again.
There, it's fine. Or it was gone.
Yeah, let me get that. Yeah.
I think it's okay. Should be fine.
Could everyone please cross your fingers? Pray to the God you believe in.
Hold on, let me try this.
Ah, there we go, I think, maybe. Yep, there we go.
Okay, now let's just try it this way first.
And then we can do...
Me llamo Yanis Reví, dirijo una compañía profesional de espectáculos que se llama Sabor de Calle. Antiguamente era una rueda de casino llamada Casino.com que ganó varios premios, entre ellos el concurso para bailar casino de la televisión cubana, un programa que fue transmitido por Televisión Internacional y fue visto en muchos países. Fue conocido el trabajo que hacíamos aquí en Cuba, una manera también novedosa de hacer la rueda de casino. Y bueno, hasta el sol de hoy, eso es lo que hacemos, juntamente con el fomento de otros bailes populares cubanos y de la danza también, la danza folclórica, la danza contemporánea.
Bueno, Jorge Luna, el director de la compañía All Star. Todavía se queda el nombre de rueda de casino porque fue por lo que surgió. Pero ya actualmente estamos representamos diversos géneros, no solamente el casino, no la salsa, sino el país de casino cubano.
Actualmente estoy en la rueda de casino, pertenezco a la rueda de casino All Star. Soy instructor de arte.
Cuando tú vas a un baile popular, tú conoces personas, su manera, a lo mejor se reúnen, que aunque no se conozcan, personas en ese momento que saben bailar bien, y empieza una rueda y le dicen yo puedo entrar y entran, ¿tú me entiendes? Y puede hacerse una rueda donde a lo mejor todos no son amigos, todos no se conocen. Y entonces sí, eso te ayuda a socializar, porque cuando ya tú conoces a la gente, ay, ¿de dónde tú eres? No, yo soy de aquí, ay, mira, yo soy de allá, ah, sí, tú vienes mucho aquí, y ya empieza una conversación que a lo mejor puede derivar o no en una amistad. Antiguamente, en los círculos sociales se hacían matinés, y iban muchos jóvenes, y ahí la gente se conocía, y no obligatoriamente tenían que hacer amigos, aunque habían ruedas específicas, la rueda del oso, la rueda de otra persona, porque le ponían los nombres a la rueda. Pero eso no quería decir que en un momento tú dijeras, yo quiero bailar, y te dijeras, no, no puedes bailar. Como se puede crear una rueda de personas que no se conocen, y empiezan a unirse, oye, vamos a bailar, y el otro dice, yo voy a entrar, oye, yo voy a entrar, y cuando viene a ver tienen una rueda y no son de personas que se conocen todos.
Cuando tú vas a una fiesta, tú bailas con una, con dos o con tres chicas, o con tres chicos, en tu caso. Pero cuando tú bailas una rueda, pueden bailar hasta 50 parejas. 100 personas bailando a la misma vez, compartiendo. El hecho además de que la pareja se intercambien es algo que le da riqueza a esa interacción social. Existe ese fenómeno de la rueda como baile social que provoca que se mezclen personas de diferentes razas, de diferentes religiones, de diferentes edades, de diferentes formaciones culturales. Yo tengo la experiencia de que por un tiempo ayudé en la formación de una rueda de casino donde habían jóvenes universitarios y habían jóvenes con problemas delictivos, o sea, con problemas de delincuencia, o sea, que no trabajaban, que habían estado presos. Y es curioso que a partir de estar en la rueda, todo el tiempo que estuvieron bailando rueda, solo se dedicaron a eso, su vida cambió, trabajaban, o sea, la rueda sirvió como un proceso educativo que lo sacó un poco del mal ambiente en que normalmente vivía. Y entonces, en ese sentido, creo que la rueda de casino tiene una fuerza tremenda para unir personas que normalmente, de otra manera, no se hubieran cruzado nunca en la vida.
Salimos a fiesta, bailamos con quien vaya a divertirse en la fiesta.
Yo he tenido experiencia con todas las edades.
Bailamos con personas mayores, con jóvenes, con niños.
Personas muy jóvenes, personas de la edad de 30 y pico de años, y he tenido personas mayores.
No tienen que ver nada, ¿verdad?
Alberto va a tocar, y acaba de llegar al baile. Pepe con su rueda de casino, así formó la rueda y así formó. Se queda sin bailar casino, y así formó. Y por eso busca tu pareja. Quisiera que bailaras, pero que no te vuelvas loca. Busca tu pareja, para que lo bailes, para que lo goces.
Should be okay. I can do it from here, I think. All right, so that was a major feat to put that together. I had never done video editing before, so I'm very excited that you guys all got to see that. And now what I would like to do would be to present the results of the survey that I created on the same topic in the United States. So essentially, there were three main hypotheses of my survey related to what the dancers were talking about and the heads of dance companies were talking about in the video. In particular, that casino can stimulate diversity in the sense that casino dancers interact with people of different racial groups and age groups. Also, that it's a great way of forming community. And also, and this was my experience, that through dancing casino and being involved with Cuban dance, that it's a great way of piquing individuals' interest about Cuban culture and society and Cuban history outside of dance. So those were the three main elements of my survey. Quickly to talk about the methodology, it was available both in English and Spanish, and I conducted 2 pilot versions to gain feedback on the clarity of questions. Once it was made live, it was available for roughly 3 months and publicized primarily through dance Facebook groups and also through dance companies. I contacted them, explained what the survey was about, and asked them to disseminate to people in the dance community. In order to be eligible, dancers had to have been dancing at least once over the last 12 months, and they also had to have resided in the United States for 6 months out of the past 12 months. And also, as a small incentive, there was a free pass given away to the New York City Ruedo Weekend, which is a very fun festival. And overall, there were 331 individuals who responded with a very high completion rate, 83%, over 23 states in the United States. So that's actually quite high for surveys. Typically, we see about 60-70% completion rate. Before delving into the results, I would just like to talk a little bit about the demographics of the respondents. So there's quite a wide range of ages. 70% are between the ages of 20 and 45 years old. A slight majority compared to other races of people who self-identified as white or Caucasian, 40%. However, 20% also identified as Hispanic or Latino, and then another 10% as Cuban, and roughly another 10 or 12% as African American or Black. There was a slight majority of females who responded to the survey, and also a very wide range of time that individuals have spent dancing. 28 between 1 to 3 years, but also another 20% had danced for over 9 years. The sample was also quite educated. 77% had obtained at least a bachelor's degree or higher, and then on top of that, another 12% had attended at least some college. So what I'll do going forward is present the results of the different hypotheses of my survey. I organized this thinking about time. If I run out of time, I think that these are the topics that are most exciting to me in terms of the results. So individuals' motivations, followed by the impact on interest in Cuban culture and society outside of dance, and then racial and age-based diversity. So here what pops out to me is that 99% of the respondents, so as you can understand from this data, holds across racial categories and age groups, responded that one of their main motivations for dancing casino was to build community and to increase friendships. And on top of that, 93% of individuals say that they dance in order to increase happiness. Maybe this isn't surprising to those of us who dance, but I think that it's quite telling because only 78% of the respondents say that they partake in casino in order to increase their amount of exercise. So really, I think it speaks to casino's ability to build community and increase happiness, and that this outweighs other potentially more obvious results. As Yannick, the first interviewee in the video, had mentioned, perhaps this is because of the circle dynamic. You're changing partners and you're sharing, and this creates a common experience, which of course builds community. In terms of casino's impact on Cuban culture and society outside of dance, the results are also quite interesting. When I think about history and culture of a country, I think about really three elements. Food is the main one, right? Music, and then also history. And so what we see here is that when dancers were asked how Cuban casino impacts the frequency with which they engage in these activities outside of dance, 85%, a huge majority, say that now they listen to more Cuban music. So not just that they had listened to Cuban music in general, but they're listening to more actively outside of their dance setting. Almost half, 48%, say that now they'll go to a Cuban restaurant or they'll go to a Cuban restaurant more often. So we see people actively engaging in Cuban culture through food. And 40% of respondents are now reading about Cuban history. I mean, this is amazing because individuals who maybe didn't know anything about Cuba are now wanting to engage and learn about the history of the island. And in fact, that was my case when I first started being interested in Cuba. It was through dance. Other elements that are quite interesting to me is that these three categories outweigh the perhaps more obvious category, which is buying outerwear that is pertinent to a dance. And also, 1 out of 4 respondents is now reading newspaper articles on Cuba, and 1 in 5 are reading about Cuban politics, and also 1 out of 5 of these 331 respondents have traveled to Cuba. In terms of generating racial integration, so in this part of the survey, the respondents were asked to gauge how much racial integration they perceive in their dance setting. So what percentage of individuals are of races other than your own in your dance setting compared to leisure activities? And I'm defining significant diversity as people who say that more than half of individuals are of races other than their own in their dance setting or in their other leisure activities. And so here what we see is that 64% of individuals have reported significant diversity in their dance setting, and that's compared to only 48% in other leisure activities outside of dance. Now, of that 64%, 1 in 5 is saying that 70 to 80% of individuals are of races other than their own. What's interesting about this is that there aren't any clear trends when we look across racial categories. The two that really stood out to me that are quite interesting are for individuals who self-identified as white and Caucasian versus Hispanic or Latino. So in this case, we see that there's more racial diversity for those who have self-identified as white and Caucasian in their dance setting compared to in other leisure activities. Whereas the opposite is kind of true for those who self-identified as Hispanic or Latino. So that's something that I would like to look into further. Of course, there were more individuals who self-identified as white in the survey, so there's a potential bias there. But on the other hand, perhaps that it speaks to this element of experiencing more diversity in the dance setting and coming together with individuals who are not those who you interact with in your normal daily life, for example, in going to a happy hour or in other activities. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about the age-based integration. So in the same sense that dancers were asked about racial integration in terms of their perception, here they were asked about how they perceive individuals of different age groups in their dance setting. So 50% or significant diversity rather means that more than half of the dancers in their setting are of age groups other than their own, so either 5 years or more older or 5 years or less younger. And the numbers are actually quite similar. Again, we see 64% are experiencing significant age-based diversity in their dance setting, compared to only 45% outside of dance. Of this 64% that experience significant diversity, again, 1 in 5 is saying that only 20 to 30% of dancers are in their same age range. In this case, the results do hold across age groups, where we can really see that in the casino dance setting, there are large differences in the age-based diversity when one is dancing compared to in other leisure activities. So, in order to be respectful of time, I just wanted to close with some ideas that I've had about next steps. Some of them are more practical and operational, and others refer to research. So I think that casino, and in particular Rueda Casino, is a great way of uniting communities and building a really strong sense of belonging and membership to the environment where one lives. So one idea that I've had would be to create casino programs, for example, to bring together individuals in different types of schools, maybe a preparatory school and a public school, and show kids that through dancing together and changing partners, that maybe the stereotypes that they have of one another are in fact not as strong as we would assume. I have many other ideas that I would be happy to discuss with anybody who is interested in brainstorming. The second way in which I see applications for this work would be stimulating interest in Cuban society and culture. This was my case. I never thought that I would be presenting at ASCE nonetheless about Cuban dance, but as we can see, dance is actually a great way for individuals to engage in Cuban culture and society. Many people were reading about Cuban history, were reading newspaper articles, were engaging, at least through reading about Cuban politics, whereas this likely would not have been the case otherwise. And lastly, as it pertains to future research, I think it would be great to do comparisons to other types of dance. That would make these findings more robust, but also I'm interested to see whether or not this phenomenon is unique to Cuban dance, and in particular to Rueda. Is it really a circle effect? What are the differences with Rueda and traditional salsa, where it's not as dynamic and people are just dancing in twos? Or what are the comparisons to sports? Lastly, I think it would be extremely interesting to see if, beyond the dance setting, whether friendship circles have become more diverse. That has been my case, but I don't know across the sample of individuals who have responded. And then lastly, it would be interesting to see how we could better advertise or market casino to pique individuals' interest. So the other data that I didn't have time to present today actually goes into quite some detail, asking individuals where they dance, how much time they devote to dancing, and also how much money they spend on each of these activities. For example, a casino congress versus lessons versus going to a club, etc. And so through that information, because I have all of the microdata on the individuals that responded, theoretically I could simulate some model of trends across population and see how to attract different types of people, who's more interested in other for various events. So thank you very much for this unconventional presentation. I'm excited to have been able to present.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca. Now we're switching themes and we're moving to a paper by Antonio Diaz, David Cabrera, and Arturo Cancino from the University of Florida. Their paper is titled Evaluation and Design of Algal Growth, Harvest, and Utilization for Various Applications in Cuban Infrastructure. So, gentlemen, 15 minutes.
Let's see. UM? No. UF, right? Let's see. Is that it? No.
Should be a folder.
Oh, it's the folder. Ah, Llama. Okay, you want me to do this, and then you guys can select those two?
Yeah.
That's the PowerPoint, and then maybe, are those embedded in the PowerPoint?
Yeah, it should be.
Oh, okay, great.
So hopefully everything goes smoothly.
All right, we're good there, we're good there. All right, you guys are on.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Cabrera. I'm a senior mechanical engineer at the University of Florida, joined by Arturo Cancino, who is a senior computer software engineer at the University of Florida. And we're going to talk to you about evaluation and design of algal growth, harvest, and utilization for various applications in Cuba's infrastructure. So currently, Cuba has this notion that algae is not a positive thing in the island, both geographically and just agriculturally. It's kind of just frowned upon. This is because Cuba has large masses of algae that they can't really do anything about. As shown in this picture, the green surrounding the island is either polluted water or algal growths, and Cuba's wastewater infrastructure doesn't allow for the contaminated water that comes from agricultural runoff or factory runoffs to be properly treated, so most of it ends up in the waterways. This polluted water attracts a lot of algae and creates what's called toxic algal blooms. Now, these algal blooms are really harmful for both for humans and wildlife around the island. And these algal blooms occur not just in the coasts of Cuba, but also in the fresh waterways inside the island, so like in rivers and in lakes and such. So these algal blooms create an even more severe problem called eutrophication. Eutrophication is a process by which there's way too much algae for the wildlife to consume in time, so most of it dies, and when it dies, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean or the waterway, where bacteria consume the dead algae, and in this process, it eats the oxygen that's stored inside the algae, and it releases carbon dioxide to the water. Now, the excess levels of carbon dioxide in the water and the lower levels of oxygen in the water make it really hard for life to blossom, I guess, in the waterways. And this is mainly due to to Cuba's lack of wastewater infrastructure.
Cuba's current water infrastructure treatment is very outdated. It's over 50 years old. Therefore, it's very ineffective. Currently, what they use as a main source of water treatment is what's known as stabilization pools, which is a very inefficient method of treating the water. It's very ineffective at removing the particles or the harmful particles in the water. They currently don't have access to chlorine, which is essential for the effective water treatment. Oh, excuse me. Okay, so, well, the point is it's a highly inefficient infrastructure at the moment. We also wanted to address the problem of malnutrition in the island. Currently, the main problem with malnutrition is the fact that the livestock in the island it dies constantly. As of 2013, that was the main cause of malnutrition, is just the cattle not surviving, and that's due mainly to an improper nutrition. Currently, they don't have access to a protein-rich diet to provide to their cattle and swine. And what they've done in order to deal with this problem, it's the reopening of factories which specialize in the treatment or in the use of sugarcane, and as a result, they use the gas from the sugarcane as a source of animal feed.
So what we're proposing as a solution to both the wastewater problems, the excess algae, and the malnutrition of the cattle and swine is a supplemental treatment that utilizes algae and is decentralized. We wanted to make sure that Cuba is able to see algae not just in the negative light, but in a positive way. So our solution is a two-phase treatment. We start off with a raceway pond. Now, the raceway pond pretty much contains an engine, 2 car batteries, a solar panel, propeller, and a wooden frame. And what we try to do with this system is we introduce wastewater or harmful toxics in the water into the system. The system is in constant motion, and we have microalgae in the system. So the microalgae is going to utilize the contaminants found in the water as a source of nutrition, and it's going to utilize the sunlight as well to, I guess, prosper. And the second phase of our system is a photobioreactor. Now, this photobioreactor is made of PVC hinges, acrylic tubing, and a wooden frame. And what we want to do with the photobioreactor is utilize the same wastewater to help promote the growth of microalgae, as well as utilizing flue gas, which comes from smokestacks in factories, to help algae grow faster.
To put things in perspective, here's a simple diagram of what our solution would look like implemented into a factory. In this case, it's a paper mill. To explain this, the water coming out of the wastewater coming out of the paper mill will be directed into the open pond system, as well as a portion of the river in which it's constructed. Inside the open pond system, the microalgae will be in constant motion, and it'll grow due to the waste inside in the water and the light coming from the sun. Part of this, the wastewater will be directed onto the photobioreactor, which will be attached to the smokestack of the factory, and it will gain access to the gas emitted from the factory, in this case, flue gas. So it'll gain access, or it will take advantage of the carbon dioxide being emitted from the smokestacks of the factory, as well as light from the sun and the waste inside the water, containing the water, to grow at an increased rate in comparison to the open pond system. As a result, as mentioned, we will be gaining algae, and we'll be also reducing the carbon dioxide emissions onto the atmosphere, as well as reducing the amount of waste going out into the river. This wouldn't be Cuba's first attempt at working with microalgae. What you see on the screen is a picture of a concrete raceway pond, which, unlike our wood-based design, is not flexible. Once you install a raceway pond, you're unable to move it anywhere. It'll take more to keep it in repair-wise. It'll take longer to keep it working effectively. They've also worked with spirulina, which is a protein-rich strand of microalgae, which has been used in the past to treat protein deficiencies in different areas of the world successfully. And another example there is the incline canal, which is just another method of growing microalgae. All this has been done in Cuba in the past. This graph, the main purpose of this graph is to show that Cuba is in an optimal location when it comes to, in terms of promoting the growth of microalgae. This is an even distribution of solar radiation all over the island, excuse me. And as you can see, it's not too high, nor is it too low. It's at an optimal spot to promoting growth. Additional steps can be taken to ensure the proper growth of microalgae, as well as reducing the amount of risk. What you see on their screen is an example of what's known as Arduino software code, which is responsible for reporting the temperature in the open pond system onto a computer. We've actually implemented this solution onto our sample model, which you will see now. Yeah, it's please excuse the couches in the background, but this is simply to show that we've managed to make just a sample model. What you see in the background is the photobioreactor, and in the front is the open pond system with water inside. And what you see there is the chip responsible for reporting the temperature to our laptop. Not only that, you can also implement things that will help you check things such as the pH balance of the water, water flow inside the systems, and all that will just help ensure that the optimal growth of microalgae and reduce the risk of losing the microalgae, the crops.
Now, something we really took into consideration when designing our solution was risk mitigation. Cuba is located in the Caribbean, and it's in a prime spot for getting hit by hurricanes and by tropical storms. So what we really wanted to make sure was that our system wasn't going to break in case of these events, and that the algae contained in our system wasn't just going to go into the wild, making the eutrophication problem worse. So we really cared about the high winds. That's the biggest concern was high winds, and we took several steps in our design to make sure that in case of high winds, there wouldn't be extended damage and there wouldn't be exposure of the algae into the wild. So, for example, the raceway pond was made out of wood. It was a wooden frame, and the wooden frame allows us to be able to remove the raceway pond in case of a tropical storm or a hurricane, store it until the storm's passed, and then put it back in place. The photobioreactor with the PVC hinges on top allow it to open and close. By closing the photobioreactor, it's very easy to store, and it could also just be put back out there after the storm has passed. So hopefully, by implementing all these solutions, Cuba could see algae in a different light, and it could utilize algae for more than just the water treatment, but it could also utilize algae as a source of protein-rich animal feed. Now, Cuba, as of 2012, imports close to 50% of their meat products, and it also imports close to $60 million worth of soybean. Soybean is used in Cuba as a protein-rich animal feed. Now, as of 2012, 42% of the food products that Cuba imported were animal feed, like monetary-wise, was spent on animal feed. So by using algae as a source of animal feed, Cuba could, in essence, reduce the amount of money they spend importing soybeans, and in turn, it would also decrease the amount of meat that Cuba imports.
What you see here is a very rough estimate of what a single implementation would cost of the solution in just one single factory. We wanted to create a solution that was low in initial cost in order to make this a decentralized solution so we can implement it hopefully all over the island. This does not take into account the amount of money saved that would be, but the amount of money that would be saved by lowering the required imported source of feed for livestock, nor does it include the amount of money that could be saved by not implementing the alternative solution. Speaking of the alternative solution, it is estimated that in order to completely treat the entire wastewater infrastructure in Cuba, it will cost a total of roughly $5 billion, and that is to completely fix the wastewater infrastructure. Keep in mind, this doesn't include the amount of money that would be required to have a constant source of chlorine and repairs that these facilities would demand. Not only that, it also, by implementing the alternative solution, additional sectors of the island will be affected, such as transportation, as you can see here.
Now, algae could be used for more than just cleaning the water and as a source of protein-rich animal feed. It could be used as compost. Compost is nutrient-rich soil, and it could be implemented in most of the island to help fertilize the ground, and it could be used in orgapónicos, which are community gardens, which provide the Cuban people another source of food. Algae could also be utilized as a source of biogas. Cuba has recently completed a 450 kilowatt biogas plant, and if algae is utilized as a source of biogas, Cuba can, in essence, become a little more energy independent.
Cuba currently relies heavily on the use of diesel to power the thermoelectric plants as well as power generators. With microalgae can be an excellent source of oil, which in turn can be used as a form of biodiesel, and hopefully in the future it could be used to replace the heavy use of diesel and help Cuba become more energy independent in the future. What you see here is simply a liters per hectare graph comparing microalgae oil yield with other more common sources of oil, such as canola and corn. And this is simply to prove the previously stated point.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next paper is presented by Daniel Pereira from George Mason University. The title of the paper is Cuban Political Parties 1902-1959, Characteristics and Implications for Democratic Stability. Go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present this paper. The title of the paper, you can see it here, basically is Cuban Political Parties 1902 to 1959, Characteristics and implications for democratic stability. And I chose this topic and this period in particular because, first, I'm very passionate about it. I find it just incredibly fascinating, but also because it's one of those topics in Cuban history in general that is often glossed over, ignored, and in many cases forgotten, both by Cubans on the island and by Cuban exiles in the United States and in other cities around the world. So just a little bit of background. Political parties began really to form in Cuba following the 10 Years' War, which ended in 1878. And at that time, there were three main factions who wanted their positions heard. The autonomistas wanted Cuba to still be part of the Spanish Empire, but to have its own autonomy, to decide its own affairs on certain important matters. Independentistas, as you can imagine, wanted full independence from Spain. And annexionistas were pushing for the United States to annex Cuba and kind of take over from Spain. 1892, José Martí founds the Partido Revolucionario Cubano and basically becomes the head of, or the philosophical head of the independence movement in Cuba through the Partido Revolucionario Cubano. And so when independence, really following the Spanish-American War of 1898, the United States comes in, a more formal party system is set up as Cuba prepares to become independent. So in the 1901 Constitution, there isn't much detail as to the party system that's going to be implemented, but there is a provision to establish a party system that's pluralistic and inclusive. When the 1940 Constitution comes along, there's a lot more emphasis on the party system that will be implemented, and there's more detail into what will come afterwards. So between 1899 and 1960, I know this is on the conservative side, but there's over 70 political parties. These are the parties that I was able to identify. And I had trouble, first because there isn't that much information out there about these parties, but also because it's confusing, because a lot of the names are similar or even the same, and it's just, but definitely at least 70 parties function within that time period. So this is just, the first section was the characteristics and the sources of these parties. There were a lot of regional and national parties. They were personality-based, they had broad-based support, and they relied heavily on symbols to appeal to the people. Regional and national parties, there were provincial parties that operated separately from and in competition with those at the national level. And I just give some examples here. Partido Republicano was the national one, but then there was Partido Republicano Federal de las Villas in that province, Partido Republicano Independiente, and Partido Republicano Conservador. So you can see how the names are very similar, and how there could be confusion, and they probably had a lot of similarities, but they were independent, different parties, not branches of the same party. So these parties prevailed during the first half of the Republic, if you will, so 1902 to maybe the 1930s. They were very heavily personality-based, and this is a result of the Spanish influence, the idea of caudillismo, which the Spanish brought to Latin America, and you can still see today. Caudillismo is the idea of a military figure kind of heading the government, but when you translate that to politics, it's one person kind of dominating the political party that they head and having that influence. So people a lot of times weren't, they didn't call themselves conservatives or liberals or auténticos or ortodoxos. That came later, But there were a lot of people that were either estradistas, masoistas, miguelistas, menocalistas, machadistas, etc. And batistianos, I'm sure you've heard that term. So they identified with a person, not as much with the party. And if that person switched parties, they would probably just switch parties with them and go into whatever new political venture they entered. For example, the liberal-conservative feud of the 1910s, 1920s was centered around two people, Jose Miguel Gomez and Mario Menocal, both generals of the War of Independence with massive followings and literally fought wars with each other during the Republic over over power. And then later on, there was also a rivalry between the auténticos and the ortodoxos in the 40s and 50s. Again, personalities deciding, what motivated that. Broad-based support, there was an appeal across socioeconomic and professional lines for parties. The communists and socialists had support both from the working class, but also from professionals, attorneys, and other professionals who supported it. And interestingly, the members of the armed forces could not vote by law. It was in the Constitution. But the military developed certain allegiances to Batista and other officers that later on influenced with the 1952 coup and who was in power after that and how the power base was decided. So the results, one was campaigning for the same base, another one was the banning of political parties on some occasions, the other was coalitions required to govern, and the fourth was party swapping. Here you see a sample ballot, or actually a copy of a ballot from the 1940s, I believe, and you have the parties and you see the lists, and it's like you see the coalitions, how those were formed. And then the Carlos Brillo ad, going back to the campaigning for the same base, you're trying to get labor, but competing with the communists in that ad. So campaigning for the same base, parties, factions had similar ideals but different leaders. And they needed to compete for votes for the same base. So the left of center parties, the auténticos, the ortodoxos, Partido Socialista Popular, the socialists, had similar platforms, and sometimes they were almost identical in terms of social issues. But then again, this reinforced the support for an individual over a party or a party ideology. And there were other factors that people looked at when they were voting for a candidate. The person's service in the War of Independence, especially in the early years. Their pedigree, if they had a last name or if they were related to a former president or another political family, that also influenced. Banned parties, again, this was caused by the will of a party leader many times, especially if they were in power, if they were president. Early on, the Partido Independiente de Color, which was a party based on race, was banned by a law presented by the gentleman on the right, Senator Martin Moroa Delgado, basically banning all political parties based on race. Led to a revolt that was crushed by the government, and the party was obviously banned. That's what caused the uprising. And then the Communist Party was almost banned in the 1940 Constitution. There was a proposal to do so, but it was voted against. So the Communist Party did maintain, but there were attempts to ban some parties. The requirement of coalitions needed to govern in Cuba, especially after the 1940 Constitution was implemented. This can hinder the stability of the democratic process because it can break down at any time. Coalitions, with the switching from one to the other, can abruptly shift the balance of power. And sometimes leaders have to compromise the core beliefs that they hold in order to govern. The parties outside the coalition have little chance of being elected on their own. So they're like the Ortodoxos, once went to an election without a coalition, and they were crushed resoundingly because they didn't have that support from other parties. And there was also a shift. This is Mario Menocal. In the 1940 Constitutional Convention, he was a delegate and was head of his party's bloc in the assembly, and ended up switching parties, or not switching parties, but his bloc's support from one faction to another, and that changed the balance of power in the Constitutional Convention and changed the dynamic. So it does change how things work out and turn out in the end. Party swapping, many leaders belong to numerous parties throughout their careers. This confuses voters and can discourage participation in the process. It leads to apathy and cynicism among the Cuban population. And as Dr. Luis Aguilar put it, he was talking about the 1952 coup and the indifference that came after that, when it occurred. General indifference to the coup underscored the depth of national cynicism with politics. So to conclude, I looked at implications for Cuba's future and a future political party system. So 56 years of democratic experience between 1902 and 1959 were no match for 500 years of a Spanish colonial mindset, and it was never able to overcome that. Added to that, you have 55 years of a dictatorship, which brings a whole set of other demons and problems to the equation that Cubans will need to struggle with. And in the end, it's necessary to understand what worked and what didn't work in Cuba's party system in order to mitigate future mistakes and ensure that a thriving and pluralistic party system functions in future Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. The next paper is by Regina Rodriguez, by Eric Bulnes, and Francisco Ferrer, and Jose Serra from the University of Florida. Regina will be presenting on behalf of her team, and the title of the paper is Effective Energy Production as a Solution to Cuba's Oil for Doctors program. But before you begin, Regina, I have an announcement. We have another paper that we added to the program that we really would like you to stay and listen to, and I'll announce that, but we do have another student paper that doesn't appear in the program. So, Regina, whenever you're ready. 15 minutes.
My name is Regina. I actually graduated from UF in environmental engineering, starting my PhD in a couple of months now. I want to fast forward a little bit in Cuban history and think about the future. And what it could be and what we hope that it will be. As engineers, we try to look back at our motherland and try to do as much as we can to try and fix it when it does open its doors and allows us back in. So the title of my presentation will be The Effective Energy Production as a Solution to Cuba's Oil for Doctor program that is in place right now. So our motivation for this project was mostly because of the Cuban economic and energy stability. We have family back home that there's power outages, you don't get electricity, electricity is expensive, sometimes it's not available. So Cuba has, before the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet Union was Cuba's main trade. They traded sugar for barrels of oil and medicine. But after that collapse, the U.S. embargo went in place, and that limited Cuba's trading grounds. So then they had to look elsewhere. The main place they looked at was to Venezuela, and they traded oil for their medical experts. So the Venezuelan agreement titled the Convenio Integral de Cooperación, was signed in October 2000, and this called for 31,000 Cuban doctors and dentists to the Venezuelan government to train 40,000 of their medical personnel. In exchange, Cuba got 100,000 barrels of oil a day as this trade. The oil is worth $7 million a day, almost $3 billion per year. So this oil for doctor agreements has its pros and cons. Cuba gets to meet their own energy needs. They have this gift of excess oil where they have doctors coming in, but there's also a lot of cons. They have involuntary personnel, our family members back home that are doctors and are being trained to be professionals that are shipped overseas to educate their skilled people. Doctors are reported to provide poor service due to low wages back home, and there's a lot of dependency for this imported oil. So there's a lot of reasons for Cuba to implement new energy technology, creating a long-term steady energy after the initial investment. There's a human rights action to these doctors being away, and improving their health care, providing this money into the healthcare system as well. So the ideal energy method that we would be looking for and implementing would be clean, self-sustainable, effective, and non-variable, something that is stable and won't be on and off, and your lights won't go off. So our proposed method is geothermal energy. And this proposed solution of geothermal energy has been implemented in several countries, Iceland, Hawaii, Philippines, countries that are well off and countries that are starting off as well. So it's a give and take. This geothermal energy can be implemented through volcano use, geysers, hot springs, fumaroles, and geothermal fields. So this energy turns turbines and creates generator, or goes through a generator and creates this load through heat exchange of that working fluid. So pros and cons to geothermal energy. The pros is that it's essentially unlimited. It's part of Mother Earth. It requires little maintenance once it's already in place, and it has been implemented successfully in other countries. So the cons is that it requires a very large investment, and it requires a significant heat source that is in reasonable proximity to generate this power. The potential for Cuba is huge. So Cuba lies within one of the hottest geothermal regions in the world. As you can see in this map, Cuba is right in that main area in the middle. So there's big potentials to look at this. So the heat source near Cuba is called the Cayman Trench, and the source would be the black fumaroles right under the Cayman Islands. It's a two-story underwater volcanic chimney, as seen in that right-hand picture. It expels fluid at 450 degrees Celsius at very high velocity. It is very deep within the sea levels, so that is definitely a con that we'll talk about later. So these black fumaroles, the water seeps below the ocean floor, and it collects all of the minerals from the Earth's crust, then shoots it out at different temperatures, and so different minerals could be iron, zinc, copper, lead, cobalt, and other chemicals as acid gases and hydrogen sulfide. So the energy conversion that is proposed in this project would be a binary cycle for the power plant, which requires the two fluids, the one that's generally hot as the secondary fluid. So the secondary fluid has the low boiling point, which in this case, we were looking at maybe like a acetone or butane, something that is very low boiling point. The secondary fluid converts to steam and turns the turbine. The turbine power then generates to produce energy, as seen in that right-hand side picture. The application for Cuba would be a power plant near the city of Cienfuegos, which is the one closest to the mainland. are in the middle of the country. We would install pipelines from the black fumaroles to the power plant through the ocean floor. So the system requirements is here below. So 100 turbines, 100 pumps, 100 heat generators, and different facilities to house these turbines, pumps, and generators. The system cost is very detailed here. It's very basic. We took different plants that have been built and scaled up. So we're looking at a $14 billion estimate. This is a big amount of money. So looking at different funding opportunities will be crucial. So the expected system outcome would be to produce 40,000 barrels of oil per day. So barrels, this is not like a energy unit, it's like in terms of barrels of oil replacement for the actual oils that we are burning at this point. And this plant will generate nearly 36 times the size of a geothermal plant of the world is required. A quantity equal to a third of Cuba's daily energy consumption. So the engineering challenges here are very large, but there is a determination of the fumaroles, the rich regions where these fumaroles exist. Then there's accurate assertions of the pipes, the pipe materials, which would have to be looked at very extensively. The long-term pipe corrosion, because there's acid gases and other minerals that could create corrosion. Minerals are a generation of steady flow, maintenance of underwater piping. So looking forward, the economic impacts, how would this affect Cuba? So looking at job creation, there's a startup, the exploration, and the drilling, and the construction and operation and maintenance. So these doctors that are coming back, they won't be jobless. They will be able to integrate back to the society, and more jobs will be created in this sector. There's also the development of the electronic market. Cuba had a 2006 energy revolution, and this could be the second aspect of that. There's also increasing the economic stability, independence from foreign energy, and maybe creating more energy than what they actually use, which could be sold to different countries within the Caribbean. And also tourism. There's a potential to create this infrastructure where tourists will come and visit, researchers and other technological people from different countries. So the second aspect would be ecological and political impacts. There's a zero emission and high efficiency through this geothermal facility. It would be non-variable because it would be running consistently. It also adds to Cubans' effort towards green technologies, and it negatively impacts on the ecosystem. It can be avoided if the minerals are filtered back into the ecosystem, the minerals that are taken from the ocean floor. The political impacts would be the end of the dependence of the Venezuelan oil trade, the reduction of this unethical trade of our people, of our family members, as payment for this oil, and there would be new motivations for trade. Diplomacy and other profits can be seen by trading this new energy. So in conclusion, this does seem like a very out-of-the-box, very unattainable project that's proposed, but we do see the fact that we need energy independence. There needs to be a long-term sustainable energy solution, and we have to decrease, it would be a decrease in Cuban medical internationalism. And I think that's it.
Okay, so we have a guest paper which has been added to the program, and it's by Eric Antman and by Leonardo Barrera, and the title of the paper is Cost-Benefit Analysis of Wastewater and Public Health Upgrades in the Upper Almendares Watershed. So, gentlemen, 15 minutes.
It works. Alrighty, a very good afternoon, now evening. As Dr. Corzo introduced, my name is Eric Antman. I'm a graduate student studying civil and environmental engineering with the University of Miami here in Coral Gables. And before we begin, I would like to thank Dr. Corzo and all of the people of ASCE for their hospitality, as well as our faithful competition from the city of Gainesville and the other universities. It's truly our privilege to be here. I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Leonard.
Hi, my name is Leonard Barrera Allen. I'm a senior at the University of Miami studying civil engineering, and the other two teammates are Sergio Claure and Miguel Amezcua, which are also part of our civil engineering program.
Alrighty, and what we're going to be talking about today is some water quality issues and proposed public health upgrades that we've developed for the Upper Almendares watershed. And the reason why we've done this is there's serious public health threats posed by the current state of the system. And we found that infrastructure investments, beyond improving the intangible quality of life issues, present a positive cost-benefit situation here in Cuba. So here's a very brief outline of our talk. We're going to introduce the Almendares watershed and what exactly our problems are. We're then going to go into what the proposed remediation would be from a technical perspective. And then Lenny will go on and develop the economic aspects of those improvements and the cost-benefit analysis we develop. So, the Almendares River is displayed on your screen in green, and it's only 30 miles long, which seems to a lot of people like a fairly insignificant river. However, it is the single largest water body in Cuba's Havana province, and it forms a very important urban waterway through the city of Havana and the outlying areas. You'll notice we divided it into two regions, one which is outlined in orange and the other in red. That is the lower and upper Almendares watersheds, respectively, and they're separated by that white feature, which is the Ejército Rebelde Reservoir. And that feature is important because it cuts into the underlying aquifer due to its depth. And what that means in a more physical, hands-on perspective, we're going to go into a brief hydrology lesson here. We start out with the ground surface that you see there in black, and then we have the typical underlying soil, sand, clay, whatever have you, and then we have an aquifer underneath that. You all should be somewhat familiar. It's the same sort of hydrology we have here in Florida and in most of the tropical regions of the world. The trouble is that the reservoir does something like that. It's deeper than the sand, soil, clay layer, so it penetrates the aquifer. Therefore, what happens is when we release contaminated runoff into the reservoir, we release contaminants into the aquifer. The aquifer goes downstream, is used for drinking water, causes quite some problems. And here we have the upper Almendares, where you see the Ejército Rebelde to the left of the screen. And the three main point sources of runoff we identified were a sanitary outfall, or what we would consider common sewage from the city of Cotoro. We have a steel mill that produces a wastewater high in cancer-causing materials. And we have a brewery which produces a wastewater that, while not as harmful to human health, has serious ecologic ramifications. And these discharges, combined with the nature of that reservoir, create a very dangerous pathway to the drinking water supplies. We start off with organic wastes, agricultural runoffs, and feces from infected people. They flow into the surface water runoff and into tributary streams, which in turn enter the upper Almendares, go into the aquifer through that reservoir, then enter the potable water system and return to the people. And you wind up with a very dangerous cycle. It becomes a case of the chicken and the egg. The cycle self-sustains itself and causes a continuous threat to human health. And the reason why this happens in Cuba and not in the United States is there's several barriers to disease transmission which we have in the United States, which currently are not applicable to Cuba. These are, there's a lack of diversion for wastewaters, which we have here through a sewer system. There is the Ejército Rebelde, which allows surface contamination to become underground contamination. And finally, there's the lack of treatment of potable water. So now we're going to go into more of the contamination illness as well as the cost of disease. The trouble is, 47% of Havana's 2.1 million residents depend on the Almendares Vento Aquifer for drinking water. Therefore, slightly under 1 million people are being exposed to acute and chronic health risks every single day because of that dangerous cyclic system of contamination that we identified. And outbreaks of waterborne disease, as we all know from the terrible Ebola outbreak going on in Africa right now, even though Ebola isn't waterborne, disease outbreaks in general are very costly. For non-fatal cases, you have outpatient care, hospital care, the cost of medication, but also the indirect cost of time away from work, time that family members take away from work to care for these people, and a lot of other items. The cost of fatality, we didn't spend a lot of time there. We set the fatality cost at $129,000 per person based on some work done by Stanford University, but didn't go further than that. And next, we needed some baseline data to calibrate a model. Once again, the challenge is there's very little public health baseline data for Cuba when you're looking at the cost of a disease outbreak. Fortunately for us, in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention maintains a publication called MMWR, or Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. And even though it sounds a little bit morbid, this provided a good source of baseline data for us to build a Monte Carlo model, which allowed us to evaluate the situation in Cuba. And the two cases we decided to use were one in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in which some 403,000 people were sickened with a waterborne disease called cryptosporidium, which was caused in very simple terms by the contamination of drinking water supplies with cow feces, and a case in Carrollton, Georgia, in which 13,000 mostly young adults at a summer camp were sickened with a bacteria in untreated well water. And both of these showed this curve, which divides cases into mild, moderate, and severe. Mild cases would be somebody becomes ill, loses a day or two of work, uses over-the-counter or antibiotic medication, but does not need intensive health care. Moderate cases involved more involved outpatient care, but didn't become hospitalization cases. And finally, severe cases were people who were hospitalized, sometimes for extended periods of time. And we found that this follows a very nice power law relationship. 90% mild, 10% moderate, 1% severe. We fed that into our Monte Carlo model and come up with these two scenarios. The 50th percentile outbreak, and I'm emphasizing the word outbreak because this isn't the 50th percentile day in the year or your 50th percentile walk in the park. This is your 50th percentile public health crisis. It's going to cost us a total of $28.5 million. 95th percentile is so exaggerated because that is a very, very rare event. So we're not going to focus on that too much. So we set the average cost of one public health issue from a waterborne disease outbreak at $28.5 million. Now, Leonard's going to look at what our costs are going to be to prevent that $28 million outbreak.
Now, in order to prevent these outbreaks, we needed to look at each one of the sources of contamination. And the first source that we have is the city of Cotorro. That would entail building a wastewater treatment plant that would cost approximately $24 million in order to provide the treatment that would eliminate some of the most dangerous pathogens found in the wastewater. Next is the still mill, Antiena Acero. And in this still mill, our main focus is to reduce the amount of heavy metals that are carcinogenic and can cause chronic illness. And then finally, we have the Cervecería Hatuey, which the wastewater from this brewery would cause a lot of ecological impacts. And as you can see, the cost of these industries or to build these facilities is much less than the cost of a 50 percentile outbreak. So that really underlines the importance of building a wastewater infrastructure that will prevent these kinds of outbreaks. Now, in order to fund these different facilities, we have to look at how exactly are you going to fund them? The Cotorro wastewater plant is the most amenable plant or facility for funding because it will be backed by an institution such as the government and or a future transitional government, and the World Bank or the IDB could back it. But for other industries such as the steel mill and the brewery, you would have to analyze and see if it is in fact feasible to fund these industries. Presuming that they are owned by current government, they would be transferred privately by some kind of auction or other different means. The owner would have to assess all the costs that are included in order to reduce the environmental and health impacts of these industries. So these industries need to be looked more closely in order to find the appropriate funding for them. So in conclusion, the health impacts of pollution are estimated at about $24 to $28 million. The Cotorro wastewater plant would be the most critical upgrade due to the nature of its effluent, which is very harmful. And the steel mill and brewery upgrades cost less, but you need to investigate if their funding is feasible. And finally, the cost-benefit analysis shows us that it is very important to upgrade the current wastewater infrastructure in Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to ask for another round of applause for all the student papers. We have allocated some time for discussants, and we will proceed with the first discussant, who is Professor Orlando Justo from the City University of New York. He's a professor of economics at CUNY, a colleague of mine, and he will comment on the papers by Roberto Gonzalez and the paper by Daniel Pereira. And I will ask the discussants to be very brief and succinct because we are way over time and we want to leave some time to interact, for the students to interact with the audience. So, Orlando.
Good afternoon for everybody. Congratulations to all the students. Very impressive, honestly. I came here 10 years ago as a student, and it wasn't as interesting as this one, I could say. I'm curious how so many students are doing things that could be used for free by the Cuban government without paying you the copyrights or the, patents, in spite of embargo, I would say, But very interesting, all of them. Really, really, really happy to see that. My first comment for Robert, I'm going to go in order, okay? Robert, very, very good, very interesting. I enjoy a lot reading your paper. I'm fascinated with the statistical analysis and so on, so I get deep into all your work. And I truly believe that you are reviving something that in the past, maybe some of the people who were here before us, they saw when there was a debate about the statistics, they were questioning the statistical things, the statistics presented by Cuban authorities in papers by Carmelo Mesalago and Jorge Perez Lopez that were constantly questioning the credibility of these statistics in the late 70s and so on. And now I see that you are trying to revive this, but challenging one of the jewels of the crown for Cuba, which is the infant mortality. Very, very interesting. I really think it's, I encourage you to keep doing in this. I only have a couple of comments, which I believe is for you to take a look at them, think about them, to make your paper much more, I would say, statistically rigorous, okay? One is the data that you are using It's from the Euro peristat, which is extremely transparent and carefully collected and presented, which is not the case of the statistics presented by the Cuban authorities about this issue, which is basically makes the main point of your paper, right? Then you put in a model together two sources of statistics that does not mean that you are dealing with oranges and apples, but you are dealing with oranges grown in Florida and oranges grown in Alaska. You know what I mean? So then, in that case, how can you make a regression that can reconcile this issue? You try to go with these assumptions. Your assumptions, I mean, I trying to when I read this, I didn't have the chance to read the Belkoff and Miller paper of 1995, which somehow makes me think that it's the one that influenced most your work in this issue with the EMR and what's it called? Well, yeah. But your assumptions, the first assumption, is that the LFD and END ratio of Euro and the Euro peristat, it's applied to Cuba. So then when I read that, it raised it turned immediately on a red light on me, because I said, how can we put in the same equation and assume that both are this, you know? So, and then somehow this is a little bit passing to the second assumption, right? Which is that you assume that the statistics presented are accurate or are presented correctly. The statistics could be presented, but what about the collection process of the statistics? If I collect the statistics with these discrepancies or this question mark, then once I present them, that is something that is already biased, since I could say, the methodological process of this, which could offer some kind of misleading things here. That's my concern. You know more about the specifics of this. And then the third assumption that you make is that if the LFMR and ENMR is about this, and then I said, if this can be misleading, what makes you think that the late neonatal and the post-neonatal deaths are presented correctly? So there are several variables that are affecting the infant mortality rate, and then you are questioning only two of them. The others you are assuming that are correct. So it's like you are carrying all the way to the end something that might be a little bit misleading. There might be some way to fix this. I'm not sure if statistically, based on the different ways of collecting the data, could be. Doing this type of analysis with different countries, and including Cuba, when the process is so different, it might be a little bit troublesome in a certain way. I mean, I'm just leaving this. Maybe you can compare that to an institutional analysis, because Cuba is quite unique, institutionally speaking, and the way that this is. And the IMR is an issue of main concern, okay? So, one question. Have you thought about doing this and running this comparison with, for example, Chile and Costa Rica to see if you get the same results or similar results?
Let's go on with the other comments. So, do you have any comments for Daniel's paper? Really quick. Of discussing, yeah. Let's do it like that.
Okay, very quick. Yes. Nice job. Very good, very good. Yes, the Cuban history pre-1959 was rewritten in Cuban history textbooks. I studied in Cuba all the way until I was graduated from college. And they were very rigorous, but it was a little bit biased. That you did it. Huh? Well, then you made a very rigorous, I would say, research about trying to put together all these political parties and so on. And it's a very solid work in terms of the rigors of this, okay? What I could suggest to you in terms of make this paper much more publishable and solid is that it could be interesting. It doesn't, maybe it's a working process and you're working on this, and that's how I see it at this point. But what is not really clear when I read the whole paper is what the research question is. What is what you are trying to, I wouldn't say prove, but how your paper enters into the historical debate about the political, these political issues in the pre-59 Cuba, okay? So from a methodological point of view, I see that. And I only have one question that I mean, this is just comments. Do you observe in these patterns that you went through in the political scenario of Cuba in pre-59, any sociological trend, anything that makes you believe or connect the situation that Cuba, I mean the political situation of Cuba before, or the institutional arrangement, with the lack of democracy after 1959? I mean, like a sociological pattern. I mean, I'm telling you this very briefly, and Mario, 1 second, is because, for example, my mother-in-law is Russian. And then one day I was talking to her, and then I told her, how come you guys like Putin so much with everything that he's doing? And then she told me, it's very simple. You don't understand this. We were used to the Tsar, and then we were used to the Soviet Union, and then Yeltsin came out, make a big mess, and we like strong rulers. So our country, in our culture, this is politically how we see it. And then I said, well, there is an institutional factor here that is very important. Do you see something like that in Cuba? After 400 years of colonialism, we were basically the last to get the independence, and then 56 of very shaky democracy, and then 55 more of lack of democracy?
So research questions, statistics, and so on. We have, the other discussants are going to be joint discussants, Gregory Biniansky, who is a Canadian lawyer based in Havana. We also have Josiel Marrero, who's an environmental engineer with the Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez from Havana. And so they're going to comment on the papers by Antonio and David and Arturo, and they're also going to comment on the paper by Regina and her team.
Okay, let me see if this technology works for me. I'll be very, very brief because I'm hungry. Okay, first of all, I just want to commend Regina and her team for choosing the topic. I mean, thinking about energy is crucial for Cuba, for its economic growth and its political stability, and for the world. And also commend you for thinking outside the box. I mean, when we think about renewables, we're thinking about wind, solar, and I did a kind of a very brief Google search of geothermal, and when people talk about Cuba's energy future, that didn't come up. So I applaud you for thinking outside the box. I do have a couple suggestions that I think could strengthen your argument. First of all, the geothermal only offers, my understanding is, electricity. And a huge component of energy need is not electricity, but actually movable fuel and fossil fuels for transportation. So this system would arguably only attend to those electrical needs of Cuba. Second of all is to look at the challenges for transporting energy. If you're proposing Cienfuegos to be the plant site, then you're going to probably look at those high voltage direct current systems that can get it out to the rest of the country. The other thing is, I think you're going to need to do a kind of a comparative analysis between geothermal sources and other renewable sources, because we're talking about un montón de dinero. And when you're talking about $14 billion and the amount of energy that it can produce geothermal, how much could $14 billion produce with wind farms and solar and biomass? Another thing that kind of came to mind is you're going to have to explain why there aren't any other Caribbean examples. Why no other countries that have access to multilateral financial institution funding doing what you're proposing? Also, there's the issue of scale. If I understood correctly, the plant you're suggesting would need to be 36 times bigger than the already existing plant in the world. So we're talking about a very, very big plant, which goes back to my point about doing a comparative analysis with the other renewable energy sources in terms of cost and energy production. You had mentioned this would most likely be done in a future Cuba, but if Cuba were to hear your presentation and want to take it on, there would be also the question in terms of, is it viable today in Cuba, U.S. technology? And did some of the geothermal electricity technologies, are they based in other countries that Cuba could easily access? Finally, question, why Cienfuegos? From the Cayman Canal Trench, I would think that maybe Oriente, Manzanillo, Santiago might be more viable places to have that, because you wouldn't have to, they're just much closer to the trench. And finally, I would question not finally, but I would question your doctor model. I think the doctor model will continue even if Cuba becomes independent of oil imports, just because it's producing a lot of money for Cuba. I would question the issue of, if it is a human rights issue, I know a lot of doctors that want to go abroad because they are better off than the doctors that are stuck in Cuba. Address the issue of hurricanes. To what degree does this technology, is dismantleable and protected as, let's say, the deep water drilling platforms, or is it more vulnerable to hurricanes? Mention of minerals. To what degree could minerals be recovered? You kind of said refilter them back into the system. I thought, well, if there's zinc and cobalt, maybe this would actually have another benefit apart from electricity. So I think that it's a really good focus. I think that it's important for Cuba to begin to look at its energy future and how to be independent of other countries supporting them. But I need more information to be convinced that this would be a primary energy source, but at the same time, even if it was a secondary energy source or tertiary, it's still, from what the paper showed, worth doing research in.
After those colleagues discuss, and I have to be very brief. First, congratulate to all of the students, because it's very good, and I'm very happy because the half of the student papers are talking about the future of Cuban environment and the sustainable development in Cuba. That means that the student paper panel is in better position than the rest of the panel in ASCE. You are talking of more hoping themes for the future. Congratulations for all. I have some questions for you that I will not make right now. We'll have some time about mainly engineering challenge of the application of what you're thinking, technology, volume of the wastewater that could be treated, how you will put it together, the algae and the wastewater, a lot of things that we'll be talking later. And in the case of, I have been working for 15 years, the technical Almendares River watershed advisor. I was in that working, not really very well. And really you have good approach, no approach, but there are a lot of things that we can talk later. Mainly is just continue thinking on that, and congratulations. You are really in very good thinking position for be thinking in Cuba and in Havana.
Thank you very much. So just very briefly, I sort of took the liberty to assign myself as a discussant on Rebecca's paper. I want to encourage Rebecca for bringing a very unconventional topic to ASCE, the entertainment, and your documentary, doing field work in Cuba, okay? I also want to commend you on the fact that your methodology is grounded on best practices. You were very articulate in connecting your data findings to the way that you presented the results and all that. My only comment, really, suggestion is for you to apply a similar approach to other topics related to Cuba and to come back to ASCE and continue presenting. I'll take a few more minutes, and for Roberto and the others, I'll make 1 or 2 sentence comments. Roberto, welcome again. We enjoyed your statistical analysis, and Orlando gave you encouragement to improve that and make that more sound. For Regina, I think Gregory pointed out to something that caught my eye right away, which is the assumption, as an economist, I know, well, I know very little about your topic, but that internationalism or doctors, you know, for whatever, will cease to exist, right? So that's a theoretical, more than a theoretical, that's an ideological issue to consider. And for the others, you have Yosiel, and you have a good opportunity to network here. I'm going to turn it over to Elena Soto Gabriel, who will comment on, very briefly, on the last paper, and then we'll have some questions. Thank you, Elena. From the University of Miami, I'm sorry.
No, thank you. I want to mention I am the mentor for the group. And so this is a last minute addition, so they asked me to provide some comments. I also want to mention that the Association of Cuban Engineers held a Cuba Infrastructure Challenge event, and I'm very proud to see 3 of the 5 groups here represented. And so I want to congratulate the engineering groups, and all these presentations were fascinating. But to comment specifically on the last presentation, we did discuss it. We have discussed it. The one thing I would mention is at the very beginning to make a stronger statement about what the objective is at the very beginning. I really like the description of how the contaminant sources and the cycling of the contaminants. That was really good. But again, at the very beginning, a stronger statement of objectives. So I'll just leave it at that because we're very late.
So now we have time for questions. We'll take a question from Sylvia here first, and a question from this gentleman here later, and then you come next. So go ahead, Sylvia. Yes, please.
Well, I too am very pleased at the excellence of the papers by the students, and I enjoyed Rebecca's Rueda very much. And I was reminded that about 10 years ago at the University of Michigan, we had a Rueda going on with Latin students in general, and led by a Cuban student. And it was very successful for a long time. They enjoyed it, and then he graduated, and of course, hasn't been seen since. But I was thinking it might be interesting for you to think about, maybe thinking about the different functions of a Rueda for students here in this country. Because I think that, for example, what I saw, or my intuition tells me, is that it's a very predominantly white university with a very strong black presence, the history of Detroit and so on. And so Latin students are 5%, which is several thousand people, but they need something to uphold their identity and so on. And so I think that the functions that it was playing for students here was slightly different than the functions in Cuba, but that they were both good. And can I say something about Pedreira? I liked your paper a lot too, and I think that somebody already suggested that you have to take it a little further, sort of theoretically. And my guess is that this is sort of the first stage where you have to get clear on what happened when, and 70 political parties is over and beyond my belief even. But I'm thinking also that if you go in the direction of the work of, for example, Juan Lins, Guillermo O'Donnell, with democratic stabilization and authoritarian regimes, and also someone who was my professor at the University of Chicago many years ago, Adam Przeworski, a political scientist that wrote a book on European political parties, and I think he titled it Paper Stones, that votes are like paper stones. So I think that would be helpful.
So you have a good source on the literature review here, and Rebecca, you have a good connection.
Don't worry about the mic. The mic.
Okay, all right.
No, I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, I want to thank Rebecca because she threw me back more than 50 years. Now, I need to ask you 2 or 3 questions that will enable you to be able to complete your research concerning Rueda and Casino. Are you aware where El Rueda was born? Casino Gate. And Casino Deportivo. That was not a black thing, or it was born in la matiné bailable que se hacía los domingos on Sundays between 2 and 6 o'clock. Okay, and la rueda is the way that you move, but casino is not that. Casino is you move the other way. Normally when you dance like this. And then you move this way. When you dance casino, you move the other way. And that's how the rueda was born at the Casino Deportivo. La matiné bailable. I told you because I did it many times.
Well, thank you very much. Good, interesting history. Okay, we got one more. Okay, we got one more question here. Thank you.
Yeah. I am ecstatic. I'm a chemical engineer, and 56 years ago, I worked on 2 papers. One, the ammonification of bagasse to produce a high I know, but this is very important. Thank you very much. We will go on overtime for those that wants to hear. Those that don't want, they can leave. And that's okay with me. I know. So, I work on 2 projects, the ammonification one, and about 5 years ago, I was contacted by Brazil. Read my paper 55 years later, and wanted to talk about the ammonification of bagasse. The second research I did, it was with Colorado School of Mines. I was working on the we had to produce a gas that was simulated a carbon. It's carbon CF4. CF4 is a product today. The question has to do with the next step, which is a pilot plan. Pilot plan, if any of you can come with a pilot plan suggestion, proposal, I will fund the pilot plan in Cuba.
Funding proposal, okay. Any responses? I know you guys are scattered, so Robert and
Okay, so thank you both for the comments, and I will make very brief responses. First to Sylvia. This is something that I definitely have thought about. In addition to being a fan of dancing myself, I've been able to give a couple of courses actually at George Mason University. And one idea that I've noticed, or one idea that has come to my mind is using casino as a way to integrate mentally impaired students with those who are not, and that is because there were a few students who attended this class who had obvious mental disabilities. So that's one idea. And then, of course, using Rueda as a way to engender racial integration. That's something that I would love to discuss with you later. In response to the Casino Deportivo, I did not go into the history of Rueda because of the time, but yes, this is also something that I have studied in great detail, and in particular, when I was in Havana, I was able to go to the Casino Deportivo and meet El Abuelo, El Oso. When Caruca was speaking of La Rueda El Oso, I met Del Oso. The point that I would like to make on that is that it was my understanding, and this is what they told me, that after the revolution, the Casino Deportivo became open. And so now Cuba and the government has awarded cartas de fundadores, so founders cards, to those who are recognized for starting Rueda. And as today, Rueda has Okay. Well, the point that I'm trying to make is that they have given recognition to those of, for example, African descent who have incorporated elements of rumba into the ruedas that are being danced now by the popular dance companies, for example, in Santiago. So I'd love to discuss later.
Okay, so just a quick response to Justo's comment. Justo, thank you very much for the comments. Very, very informative. So for the first one, so the regression is only for the peristyle countries. I don't include Cuba there. So I do the regression for peristyle countries. I get the coefficients, and then I multiply the coefficients times the observations for Cuba. So the regression per se doesn't have that. If you think of Cuba's being measurement error, it's not in there. It's afterwards. So about the second assumption. So the fact that the ratio of late fetal deaths to early neonatal deaths can be comparable, in Cuba and in Europe. It's for biological reasons. So there's a doctor there. He can tell you that if you look at Africa, if you look at Asia, the ratio, not the level, but the ratio would be pretty much around between 1 and 2. It's just a biological fact sort of. So for assumption 3, right, so that's something that I had to make to, the fact that, any deaths after the early neonatal period are correctly reported. That's an assumption that I have to make for identification. But notice, though, that the only problem with that assumption is that it will give me a lower bias on the estimate. So you can think of the things in the table as being, not a lower bias, a lower bound on the estimate, right? So meaning that, okay, so there is, I fixed this part, right? I didn't fix this part, right? There is a lot of, things going on here. So the overall, the sum would be, biased, but it would be a lower bound what I estimate. And then 4, it cannot be done. What you said about, comparing Brazil and all that, because that's the point of using the peristat, that they all use the same definition for late fetal deaths, the same definition for early neonatal. So when you look at other countries, they use whatever definition they want. They use, a bunch of different things.
You guys want to respond?
Well, I just want to say thank you for all the feedback and for this experience. This is my first time attending the infrastructure challenge as well as this conference. And as a computer software engineer, this is entirely different and really a great experience. And I'm more than happy to continue to make conversation with both of you after this. So.
I want to thank, again, the students for coming to the panel, for your patience being here so late, the discussants for all your contributions, and the audience for all their questions. Thank you very much.